Okay, this is a GCSE Combined Science Biology lesson. It's from topic 6, Absorbing Water and Mineral Ions, and it's part 1 out of 2 lessons. Okay, what you will need definitely for this session is a pen, pencil, paper or your exercise book, and as an optional extra you can have printed off the Venn diagram towards the end of the session, which you should find attached to Frog. Okay, so this lesson continues from the team session you had last week, which was reminding you of the photosynthesis word equation and also how the leaf is adapted to help photosynthesis take place. Today we're focusing on how water and mineral ions are absorbed. So firstly, I'd like you to record the title and date on your paper or in your book, and then please complete either starter A. So that's why do we need to water plants, what is the water used for, or you may wish to complete starter B, which is asking you to think about the functions of a root. Okay, so you might want to pause the video and have a go at doing that now. Okay, so for this session we're going to be looking at why a plant needs water. And we're going to be looking at some really important terms which hopefully you remember from some of the work that you did in topic 1, in paper 1, which was probably back in September. Now I would just want to remind you that in that topic 1, the content of topic 1 can be assessed obviously in paper 1 assessment, but it can also come into paper 2. Okay, so it's a really important topic. And you might remember some of the terms that we used in that topic: diffusion, osmosis and active transport. Probably the one that you remember most was looking at the potato chips, where we looked at osmosis in plant cells. So in today's session we're going to be looking back through these terms and also looking at the concentration gradient, and then in your next absorbing water and mineral ions session you'll be looking in a little bit more detail about how those 3 different transport mechanisms are related to plants. Okay, so for those of you who had a look at starter A, why the plant needs water, there's various reasons that you could have written down. So firstly, water is used to carry dissolved minerals around the plants. So you saw in your last session that plants have xylem vessels, and these xylem vessels have water flowing up them, and within that water are the dissolved minerals that a plant might need. For example, it might need nitrate ions in order to make protein to help it grow. Water is also used to keep cells rigid, or you might remember the term turgid. So this is about keeping the cells nice and firm so that the plant is strong and doesn't wilt. The evaporation of water through stomata also has a cooling effect on the leaves, which is similar to the effect that sweating has on our bodies. So we produce sweat, and as that evaporates from our skin, it acts to cool the skin down in exactly the same way as losing water vapour through the stoma helps to cool down leaves. Okay, and the big one, photosynthesis. So water is obviously one of the reactants in photosynthesis, and I'm hoping, as I'm talking about reactants now, that you can remember the word equation for photosynthesis. So we know that water is one of the reactants, and it needs to react with carbon dioxide, and that reaction takes place in the chlorophyll using energy from sunlight. So it's an endothermic reaction, remember, and the products of that are glucose and oxygen. Okay, the oxygen is lost from the leaves. Right, okay, so those of you who had a look at starter. So for those of you who looked at Starter B, which was looking at the functions of roots, roots are really important in helping to anchor the plant into the ground, and that is so important because it's from the soil in the ground that they're able to get the water and the mineral ions that they need. If you have a quick look at the root that you can see in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, you'll see that there are some hair-like structures that are coming off it. Now you may remember that these hair-like structures are actually really specialised cells called root hair cells, and they're specialised because of that hair-like structure, which is there to increase the surface area. So there's a much greater surface area over which the cell can take up the water and the ions that they need. Now you'll be looking at the structure of root hair cells a lot more in the next session, so I'm not really going to explain too much more about that to you now. So I had a quick brief look at why plants need water, and now we're going to have a look at the key terms in a little bit more context. Okay, so I'm just showing you this diagram really to put the terms diffusion, osmosis and active transport into a little bit of context for today's lesson. So you see we've got a root hair cell and some cells to the right of that root hair cell, and some neighbouring cells there. The root hair cell has got a very thin cell wall, and that's important in terms of diffusion because there's less distance for it to actually move. Next to the cell wall we have the cell membrane, and you may also know that we've got another organelle which is labelled towards the top of the screen called the mitochondria, and that's important in terms of active transport. So just simply to put those terms in a bit of context for you. So water enters through the cell wall by diffusion, and the water is able to diffuse through the cell walls into neighbouring cells because there's little channels, little pores within the cell wall. In order for the water to enter the cytoplasm, the water has to go through the cell membrane, and that happens by a process called osmosis. And then once in the cytoplasm, once it's gone through the cell membrane, the water can move through the cytoplasm via diffusion. Okay, now our final term, active transport, is how mineral ions enter root hair cells. Okay, so you can see there I've got a mineral ion, and the mineral ions are moved by active transport. Right, so on to our first key term, and it might be an idea if you can't remember this key term from when we looked at it back at the beginning of year 10, it might be a really good idea to jot this key term down. So the concentration gradient is the difference between two concentrations where one contains more particles in a certain unit volume than another. So if you have a look at the diagram of the particles at the bottom of the screen, you will see on the left hand side we've got a high concentration of particles, and then on the right hand side we have a lower concentration of particles, and the difference in that concentration is known as the concentration gradient. And I've just put these road signs on the right of the screen just to show you that the bigger the gradient, the bigger the difference in concentration, and that does have an effect on how quickly the particles will move. Right, so just a moment to write that down if you haven't already done so. Right, so a quick progress check. So I'd like to think about these 4 things, please. What two things get absorbed by roots? What would happen if a plant didn't get enough water? Which two transport mechanisms do roots use to transport water from the soil into the plant? And finally, what is the concentration gradient? So you might want to pause now to have a quick think about some of those. So water and mineral ions are absorbed by the roots. If a plant didn't get enough water, the cells would become flaccid or floppy and the plant would wilt. The two transport mechanisms for water are diffusion through the cell wall and osmosis through the cell membrane. And finally, the concentration gradients. Well, that's the difference in concentration between two different areas. Okay, so we've had a good look there at why a plant needs water and also what we mean by the term concentration gradient. So now we're going to move on to look at each one of those key terms, diffusion, osmosis and active transport, in a little bit more detail. Okay, so we're going to start with recapping diffusion. Okay, smells are spread by diffusion, for example. So the particles in gases and liquids are constantly moving past each other in random directions, and you can see that in the animation. And that causes the overall movement of particles from when there is more of them, the white ones at the beginning, to where there is a lower concentration, and that happens until they are, and you can see it on the screen, equally spread. So they move from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration until an equilibrium has been reached. Okay, so you can see that again in the picture that I've just put up. So particles move from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration, and that continues up until an equilibrium or an equal mix of particles is reached. And because these particles move from a high to a low concentration, so it's almost like they're kind of going down the slide that we've got there at the top of the screen. They go from high to low. We say that the particles move down the concentration gradient. Okay, so that might be a really good definition for you to note down now if you don't remember that from the beginning of year 10. I've included this slide really just as a way of refreshing or jogging your memory from when you looked at diffusion earlier on in the year. So we know that smells are spread by diffusion. So the smell of the chocolate cake moves from an area of high concentration, just next to the chocolate cake, to an area of lower concentration further away. This net movement will continue until the particles are equally spread, or we say in an equilibrium. Once they are equally spread, the particles will continue to move, so they will still move, but there won't be an overall or net movement. And it's worth remembering here that they're constantly moving just because they naturally have their own store of kinetic energy. So diffusion is a passive process. It doesn't require us to do anything. It doesn't require any additional energy. It just happens by itself. Now, one of the examples that you will have looked at when you studied diffusion was gas exchange in the lungs. Okay, so oxygen moves from an area of high concentration in the lungs, in the alveoli when we breathe in, to an area of lower concentration in the blood to be circulated around the body. And the opposite happens with carbon dioxide. It diffuses from the blood, where it's in a high concentration, to the alveoli, where it is in a lower concentration. So these two gases exchange place. hence the term gas exchange. You may also remember from your previous biology session that gas exchange also happens in leaves. So we know that carbon dioxide diffuses into leaves through the stomata from an area of high concentration in the air outside of the leaf to an area of lower concentration inside the leaves. And again, the opposite happens to carbon dioxide. The opposite happens to oxygen. Because there's a high concentration of oxygen inside the leaves, it's being made in photosynthesis. So the oxygen diffuses from inside the leaves to outside. And finally, I've included this last picture here to show the absorption of nutrients in the small intestine, just really to remind you that diffusion doesn't just happen in gases, it can also happen in liquid, in substances that are dissolved. Okay, so for example, glucose can be absorbed from the small intestine into the blood. It's in a higher concentration in the small intestine to a lower concentration within the blood. So it's not just gases, it can happen with dissolved substances in liquids too. Okay, so a quick recap of diffusion. Diffusion is a passive process. No energy is required. It just relies on the natural energy, the natural kinetic energy that particles already have. Those particles move from a high concentration to a low concentration. They move down the concentration gradient, very much like you would slide down a slide. So you go from high to low. And the bigger the gradient, or the higher the slide, the faster that diffusion will take place. Just like if you went on a much higher slide with a much bigger gradient, you'd slide down it more quickly. Exactly the same thing happens in terms of diffusion. The bigger the concentration gradient, the faster diffusion will take place. Finally, diffusion occurs in gases and in liquids. Okay, so now moving on to a special type of diffusion. Okay, so this special form of diffusion is called osmosis, and it involves the movement of water molecules. And those water molecules move across a semi-permeable or partially permeable membrane, like a cell membrane. So osmosis is the movement of water particles in solution across a partially permeable membrane, and they move from a dilute solution, so that's a really watery solution, to a more concentrated one. And actually that might be a little bit easier to see in a static picture. Okay, so if you have a look at the picture that I've just put up, you'll see on the left hand side we've got lots of these blue particles. Now these blue particles are actually meant to represent water particles, and you'll see that on the left hand side we've got a really high concentration of water molecules. On the right hand side we've got a lower concentration of water molecules. So those water molecules will move from the high concentration to the low concentration. So they'll move from left to right by osmosis. Okay. Now osmosis can get a little bit tricky when you start to add in more terms to it. Okay, so for example, that left hand side has got a really high concentration of water. There's lots of water molecules, but what that actually means is it's a dilute solution, so it's quite a weak solution. So if you were to think of orange cordial, it'd be really a weak solution of orange cordial because there's lots of water there. And the water would move from that dilute solution to a more concentrated solution on the right hand side, because there's less water molecules there. Okay, so it's just exactly the same as diffusion, but it involves water and a partially permeable membrane moving from a high concentration to a lower concentration. Now it might also just be important now to point out that this partially permeable or semi-permeable membrane means that some things can pass through and not others. Okay, so for example, water is permeable, it can pass through, but larger soluble molecules like glucose, for example, wouldn't be able to go through. Okay. Just to remind you again, you did look at osmosis in quite a lot of detail in year 10 because you did a core practical. And that core practical was involving putting potato chips into different concentrations of sugar solution, and you were looking at whether those potato cells took up water and gained mass, or whether they lost water and obviously lost mass. So that's just a quick reminder of where you've seen osmosis before. Right, so for your notes, if you wanted to have a quick summary of osmosis, again, it's passive, no energy is required. Okay, it's just using the random motion of particles. The particles move from a high to a low concentration. Okay, so they go down that concentration gradient again, and it involves just water, and that water passes across a partially permeable or semi-permeable membrane like a cell membrane. Okay, so I think it's probably a good idea at this point now for us to have a little recap about osmosis and diffusion. And what I'd like you to do is to have a go at answering this exam question. It's a 4-mark question, and I'd like you to compare and contrast osmosis and diffusion. So that means that you are going to be looking at what is similar about both processes and what is different. Okay, it might be a good time now to pause the video and just have a go at writing that down in your book or obviously on your paper. Right, so the main points that you needed to consider. Okay, so both of these processes occur down the concentration gradient, so from high to low. Both are a passive process. Okay, so those are the two similarities between them. So moving on to the differences, osmosis is about the movement of water, a solvent, and diffusion can be any liquid or gas particles. So obviously osmosis is a type of diffusion. And then finally, osmosis has to cross a semi-permeable membrane, whereas diffusion doesn't require a membrane at all. Okay, so give yourself a mark there for those 4 points, and if you need to, pause the video and add in any extra detail. So let's move on to our final transport mechanism, which is active transport. And sometimes cells require substances that occur in a lower concentration outside of the cells than within them. So, for example, plants need to absorb certain mineral ions from the soil, like nitrates, for example, to make proteins. And these mineral ions occur in the soil in a much lower concentration than is already inside the cell. So this means that the ions have to be transported against the concentration gradient. So this time they have to be moved from a low concentration to a higher concentration. Now, if we think back to the analogy that that we used to think about diffusion and osmosis going from a high to low concentration, we thought about going down a slide. This is kind of like the opposite, okay? So we have to move from a low to a higher concentration. So this is a little bit similar to thinking about walking up a step ladder. You go from low to high, and obviously as you walk up a step ladder, you need energy to be able to do that. And that's exactly the same with active transport. It's active. Energy is needed to move those particles from a low to a high concentration. So active transport is the movement of molecules from a low concentration to an area of higher concentration across the cell membrane. And this happens against the concentration gradient, so energy is required. Okay, that might be a nice definition for you to note down. Active transport requires energy, but it also requires energy to help the carrier proteins that you can see in the animation, which are the kind of big globules that span across the cell membrane there. They help to transport the substances. Okay, so let's see if we can see that in a little bit more detail. So this is a nice kind of overview of active transport. Okay, and you can see that we have got our cell membrane. Okay, and our cell membrane is actually made up of two layers, a phospholipid bilayer. You don't need to worry too much about that term. And in the middle of that layer, the purple, you have got a transporter protein which sits within that bilayer. Okay, now let's just imagine that this is the inside of a root hair cell, and that root hair cell needs to take up some nitrate ions. And you can see on the outside of the cell there is a lower concentration of nitrate than there is already within that cell. Okay, so how are we going to move these ions from a low concentration to a high concentration? Well, we know that that's against the concentration gradient, so we need energy. Okay, so the ions stick to the transport protein. Energy is then used to change the shape of the transport protein, and there the ions move into the cell. Okay, now I've shown energy there with this ATP molecule, which is now changed to ADP. You don't really need to worry too much about what that molecule is all about at the moment. It's just showing that energy is needed. What you do need to remember though is the process by which that energy is released. And I'm really hoping there that you're thinking of respiration. And that might start to give you an idea, which you'll look at in more detail next lesson, of why root hair cells, which have to undertake active transport, have got mitochondria with inside them. Okay, so our summary of transport. So, active transport, energy is required, okay, from respiration. And that's because substances move up the concentration gradient, or you might phrase it as saying against the concentration gradient. So the substances move from a low to a high concentration. You're walking up the step ladders. Now, for that to happen, carrier proteins are needed. So the proteins transport transport the substances across the cell membrane, and that's why the energy is needed. Okay, so we've had a look at our 3 objectives now, and I'm hoping that you feel confident in being able to tell me why a plant needs water, what diffusion, osmosis and active transport is, and also being able to use the term concentration gradient in explaining those 3 different processes. Now, to make sure that you are happy with those 3 objectives, I'd like to carry out our last task for today's session. So, some of you may have already printed out this Venn diagram. If you haven't, you can just simply draw it into your book now, or print it out after you've watched the video. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is to have a think about all 11 of those statements, and I'd like you to decide whether that statement applies to diffusion, osmosis or active transport, or of course a mixture of them. And then I'd like you to place them into the correct part of your Venn diagram. Okay, so it'd be a good idea to pause the video now and have a think about that and complete it in your book, please. Right, okay, so just to make things a little bit easier for me, instead of writing out the statements, I'm just going to place the numbers in the correct part of our Venn diagram. So, which processes involve the movement of particles? That's all 3 of them, okay? Diffusion, osmosis and active transport are all about moving particles. So let's look at number 2. How oxygen leaves a leaf. Okay, you maybe remember from our last session that oxygen leaves a leaf via diffusion. It diffuses from inside a leaf through the stomata back into the air, from a high concentration to a low concentration. So number 3 definitely applies to diffusion, but it also applies to osmosis. From a high to a low concentration, it goes with the concentration gradient. All 3 of our processes occur naturally, and you should be able to give me some examples for each one of those now. Right, which ones are passive? Diffusion and osmosis are both passive. They don't require any additional energy because the particles have already got their own store of kinetic energy, which means that they are randomly moving anyway. Osmosis involves water only. Okay, remember it's a special case of diffusion that involves just the movement of water molecules. Diffusion and active transport both involve the transport of solutes. So that's substances that are dissolved into a solvent, like water for example. Okay, active transport requires energy. It's active. And if you remember, it requires that energy because it's going against the concentration gradient. Like, what about a semi-permeable membrane, like a cell membrane? Well, number 9 needs to go into osmosis. It's a special case of diffusion involving only water crossing a semi-permeable membrane. Active transport is how minerals get into root hair cells, and that's because these minerals move from a low concentration to a higher concentration, so they move against the concentration gradient. So number 11 needs to go into the active transport circle as well. Right, so that's the end of our session, recapping diffusion, osmosis and active transport. In your next session, you're going to be looking at these processes more in the context of plants and root hair cells. But in the meantime, if you feel that you need to do a little bit more work on any of these three processes, I have also put onto Frog some web links and some different ways which you can revise them in a little bit more detail. Okay, thanks guys.